Benvenuti alla 33esima edizione di
Hello and welcome to the 33rd edition, 33? Yes, 33rd edition of GiovedìScienza, Science on a Thursday. Thank you very much for the round of applause, but it's the only one we will get this season. Thank you. So I would like to welcome the audience and the audience that follows us from home. Streaming, because as you know, you can both see it here in person or you can stream it. There's an experiment, and the experiment will be carried out this evening because this is not the same GiovedìScienza. We will start with a difficult thing. Now let us begin with the conference, which, as Piero was saying, is a rather special conference because it's not a conference. It's a conference that's not a conference. That's very fashionable, saying that you will be given the conference. We will have 3 speakers who will give a short introduction, and then you will be the ones asking the questions. We hope there will be lots of them, and there will be certain rules that we will read out to you. And so I would now call Alberto Mantovani, who is a professor of general pathology at the Humanitas and scientific director of the Humanitas Institute. Paolo Vineis, who's both a professor of environmental epidemiology at the London Imperial College and directs a molecular genetic department of genomics or of the Genomic Institute in Italy. And then Gianni Bona, who is an emeritus professor in pediatrics from the University of Novara and is also a member of the vaccine group for the region Piedmont. We can too sit down now. And vaccines are a very topical subject. Maybe we haven't been talking about it less. I don't know if that's good or bad, because there are other things that people are talking about. I would now leave the floor to Alberto Mantovani, who will be giving us an overall picture, a historical picture too, of vaccines. So let's give him the floor. Allow me to add that Alberto Mantovani is the most famous immunologist in Italy, and so we've really brought you an authority in this field, just as Paolo Vineis is also in the field of epidemiology. And both of them, since I love books, I would like to say that Mantovani wrote a book that was written with Monica Floranello, Immunity and Vaccines by Mondadori, which I have a signed copy of at home, and Vineis, Health Without Borders, which is a book where you will also find all the topics. There are very short chapters, but you will see all the things that currently he is studying, which means food, climate change, the chemical and physical environment, the consequences of the economic crisis, cancer, the epigenetic impact and field, all sorts of things that impact on our health, and we know that through epigenetics are so important, and he is at the heart of this problem with his research. I will stop here. Alberto Mantovani, the floor to you. Good evening to you. It's a pleasure to be here in Turin. I have a lot of friends and immunologists here in Turin. I'm going to give you a few messages which are important for the topic which we will be addressing today. The first one is that we're made up of microbes in the sense that 90% of the genetic information that we bear, more than 90%, of the information of the cells that we have are microbes. The balance with this world depends on the immune system, which governs it. So there's nothing new for our body in terms of having a vaccine. So this must be borne in mind when you think that many people say things that I would consider a little bit eccentric, that is to say that more than one vaccines have a problem. Now, I have 8 grandchildren, and one of them, as during its birth, had problems that were much bigger than vaccines. But also I would like to say that this is a system which is very harmonious. It's an orchestra. I'm still surprised at the fact that we discover new instruments and new members of this orchestra. It's harmony, but it's also an army that is battling all the time. This ongoing battle is essential to maintain a healthy balance with the outside world. There are subjects that are immune deficient, the weakest. I would like to recall, Paolo, correct me if I say something wrong, if my numbers are not right, but I think that in Italy there are about 1,500 children who are suffering from cancer, and many of these have an army that doesn't work, which means that they have a difficulty in managing the ongoing battle with microbes. By and with. This is an army that has memory, and an immunological memory is the basis of vaccine. We realized that this had a memory many, many centuries ago. For example, in the traditional Chinese medicine, people realized that if you took the pox and inoculated, say, a child with this, this child was protected against the disease, because the disease itself gave a defense. Why didn't this change the history of the world? Well, it didn't change the world because of the cost benefits. In fact, 1 out of 10 of these children died of smallpox, and the price was not worth it. So it didn't change it. The person who changed the health in the world was a British doctor who had the intuition that those who had to do with cow smallpox was immune and didn't get human one, and carried out an experiment which makes us shudder from a moral point of view, because he took a child, the child of some farmers, James Phipps, and then vaccinated him and then exposed him to smallpox, human smallpox. This changed the history of the world, or at least of Europe, because smallpox killed about 800,000 or 700,000 dead, as well as the type of suffering that they had. Immediately after, there was an anti-vaccine movement. That is to say, ethical standards changed, luckily, but immediately after this, there was an opposition, moral opposition, or presuming genetic modifications, for example, that people would turn into cattle after they'd been vaccinated with cowpox. So they opposed it immediately. And also to introduce it as a compulsory vaccination. Yes, both. I'll tell you what I think. If I lived in Sweden, I really wouldn't worry because there's 98% coverage. But in Italy, unfortunately, as we had foreseen, we've had problems. That is to say, there's been we've had, correct me, we've had 40% has smallpox, and a friend of mine had a daughter who was 30 and went into hospital because of it, and we had 6 people died of the children who didn't have or hadn't received the vaccine. We will be together for an hour. The estimates by WHO, there is a document also, if you are interested in it, you can go online, and there's a document that a group of us from the Academy wrote that there are 5 lives saved a minute. While we have this conference, there will be 300 lives saved. We, you, and I'm speaking to the youngsters here, you have no idea of what polio is. I saw polio in that a friend of mine at school, in primary school, had an atrophic leg because of polio. Polio did not just disappear into thin air. It disappeared because of the vaccine. This is another famous polio sufferer, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FD Roosevelt, and as from the age of 30, he was paralyzed. So we have lost our memory. We have lost the memory of what had happened. We don't know what diphtheria is anymore. And I think books like Nemesis by Philip Roth is important to understand what a world without vaccine was. One point which I believe is extremely important. I'm going to skip over the data. I have 8 grandchildren. This is Mattia, who was vaccinated. I think that when my grandchildren are vaccinated, it's as if they were putting on a seatbelt when I take them in the car. We put them in a specially safe place. No one objects. But there is something more than that. There's what is called a herd immunity. I don't like that because I'm not a cow, so I don't like that. But I believe that there is immunity of a community that has solidarity and that looks after the weak ones. When my grandchildren take their vaccinations or get vaccinated, it's as if they were guaranteeing that the 1,500 children that have cancer will not be affected because they can get diseases, immune system diseases, liver, other types of diseases. So it's immunological solidarity. From an immunological solidarity, we are unique. There's something which is called the histocompatibility complex, and it says that we are unique, but from an immunological point of view, we are a community that can defend itself. And this is a Bebe Vio that reminds us, that says, vaccinate, take a vaccine, vaccinate yourselves. She recalls what the impact of an infectious disease without vaccination is, and reminds us that this country has been in the forefront in producing vaccines because for example, type B meningococcus, its vaccine is an Italian product. So we should be proud of this country, which is able to change things for the best, to change the world for the best. Thank you very much.
Paolo Vineis. Passiamo la parola e il telecomando a Paolo Vineis.
Bene, grazie ancora e buonasera a tutti.
Right, thank you very much. Good evening to you all. I would like to give you some facts and figures in the sense that I think that figures are self-evident and they're obvious and in fact dramatic. If we think that in 1967 there were 15 million people who died of smallpox and 2.5 for measles. Nowadays, there are none for smallpox because it's been completely eradicated, at least in 1979, but there are about 90 to 96,000 deaths due to measles in the world. The vaccine against measles has prevented 20 million deaths between 2000 and 2015, also partly and especially partly thanks to the herd immunity, as Alberto was talking about it. These facts and figures are really extraordinary. They can't be compared to the effectiveness to most therapies. In fact, about 300 million people died last century due to smallpox before vaccines. So large numbers of people. Measles is still a major disease today, a major killer too. There are about 89,000 people who die of it in the world, which means about 10 an hour. So it's not a disease that should be underestimated. Sometimes we hear people say, well, we all had measles. It's a very marginal problem. We don't understand why we should take a vaccine. You can have a spontaneous immunization, but this is not so, because measles is a disease that does have great complications, and these are more frequent than the side effects of the vaccine. Polio, as was recalled, people mentioned what happened before the vaccine. This is a photo. These are 3 photos that are tragic, I would say. That is to say, only the older ones amongst us remember what that iron lung was. It was an artificial breather or respirator, which was a tube that these paralyzed children lived in to be able to breathe. So to have an artificial movement of their chests. I don't know if you can see it. There is a child here who's reading comics lying in this bed. This was the situation of the polio cases before we had vaccines. The situation was clearly tragic. And I think we should remember it. And these photos are a great impact. And these are situations where which have basically disappeared. There are still some small numbers in the world, but the problem has definitely been overcome. I would like to say something about the Wakefield phenomenon. That is to say, there is an opposition against vaccines that is also based on the presumed link with autism. I would like to describe it very starkly. I wouldn't give any value judgments, and I would tell you Wakefield's story, because the story speaks for itself. This UK doctor, Wakefield, published an article in an important journal, The Lancet, one of the main ones in the world, where he suggested, with a description of cases, a correlation between the triple vaccine and inflammatory bowel diseases and autism. This led to a drop of vaccinations in the UK and US and other parts of Europe, and an increase of the number of measles cases. To this date, we know that many believe that there is a relationship between vaccination and autism. But the question that you have to ask yourself in this case is if there is a causal link, cause-effect. But before talking about the cause and effect link, we have to add that Wakefield was expelled from the Royal Society of Medical Doctors because his data was fake, and that he had been funded by a group of lawyers who were trying to profit, suing the vaccine companies against autism. So they suggested to the families that they should sue the pharmaceutical companies if their children had were suffering from autism. It's a very difficult thing to establish cause-effect. There can't be only one correlation. If the overwhelming majority of children are vaccinated, clearly some of them will be suffering from autism. But this doesn't mean that there is a cause-effect relation. This, for example, is a slide which is rather amusing. You can correlate autism with a large number of phenomena that have increased, this is, for example, the sale of organic food. Now, are they correlated? I don't believe that those who oppose vaccines are focusing on the fact that organic food is linked with the cause-effect relationship to autism. It's simply a time relationship, but it's not a cause-effect relationship. So before talking about the cause-effect relationship, we must be very cautious. And in fact, the lack of a relationship, of a cause-effect relationship, was established by large-scale epidemiological studies, one in Finland on over 500,000 children and one in Denmark on more than 500,000 children. And in one case and the other, there was no relationship between the vaccine and the onset of autism. Clearly, there was a time parallel between autism and vaccination. So I think that the solid data that are not time or geographical correlation enable us to conclude that there is no causal effect between autism and vaccination. Another prejudice, but probably some of you know more about it, is that there are major economic or financial interests. There are always financial interests, but vaccines compared to other drugs are not that profitable. For instance, the vaccine that covers 6 diseases is about 70 million euro. That's 0.3% of the overall health expenditure. The HPV one is 0.1, and it corresponds to 600,000 euros a year, while, for instance, the drugs to protect the stomach lining is 1 million euros. So what I'm trying to point out is that they're not big business, but producing a vaccine is extremely costly. For instance, in only 6% of the cases, research to try and find new vaccines has success. That is to say, leads to a vaccine that is then marketed. So not everything is so obvious, not everything is so clear, but, and not necessarily are there great economic interests. There are some that have to be assessed or considered each time. There are also conflicts of interest, but all in all, this is not a problem that should lead us to refuse vaccines. And this is what I have to say. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paolo Vineis. Gianni Bona, pediatrician, who is going to give us the point of view of the pediatrician and the health policies related to vaccines. Thank you very much.
Oggi diventa difficile per chi se ne occupa da tanti anni, perché ormai se ne sente parlare in tutti i modi.
Those of us who've been working on them for years have heard all sorts of things about it in all sorts of contexts, but very often it's people who don't know or are not acquainted with clinical studies, epidemiology, so on. So I think that one should respect those who know more about this topic. Now, as was said earlier on, the problem of measles is more under control than it was in the past, but in our country, since 2013 and right up to 2017, we've had 10,000 cases, more than 10,000, and a number of deaths, measles-related deaths. The year, which is the most difficult one, was 2017, where we had 4,991 cases and 4 deaths due to measles. So this is a situation which in our country is becoming, or was becoming, very, very difficult. At the same time, we saw on a European level that the general situation of measles, this was through the European Observatory that monitors for each country the spread of this disease and of German measles that is not as strong, and enabled us to observe the fact that of all the European countries, apart from Romania, Italy stands second in terms of the number of cases of diseases in the previous year. If we then try and understand what it means that you're not vaccinated at the right moment, which is another problem, because if you're not vaccinated at the right moment, that is to say when you're 2, means that you could take the disease when you're a young adult. In fact, as you can see, the highest bar there, which corresponds to 17.3 cases per 100,000, is in the age group that goes from 15 to 39. There are more cases in smaller, younger children, but compared to the 15-39 age group, that is the largest increase, with about half of all the cases. But not just measles is still present. The ministry, through the Istituto Superiore di Sanità, that is to say, the health research department, monitors all infectious diseases. Now, I think you can see these. In 2017, invasive diseases such as meningitis, which are due to meningococcus or pneumococcus or Haemophilus B, were over 2,000 cases. And we know that, and for a very simple reason, because of difficulties to report the infectious disease or to recognize the cause, we know that this figure should be multiplied threefold, because in fact there are three times as many diseases as reported generally. Now, saying this, unfortunately, then these number of cases that are very numerous, all these cases, allow me to sidetrack, that were observed of measles, in 95% cases were people who hadn't been vaccinated. And if you needed a vaccination, proof that vaccinations work is given by the fact that you see that all the people who were diseased or who got the disease either had not been vaccinated or had not received the full dose, not just for this, but also polio, diphtheria, all the ones that are listed here on this slide. All these diseases, the number of people who are vaccinated on the total, which is free, one should remember, since 2017, 10 vaccines that are the compulsory ones, but also others that are only recommended, are free of charge under the national health system. At the end of 2017, we had a coverage of vaccines, of people vaccinated against measles, which was 87%. Now, what Professor Mantovani was saying before, this herd, the herd, or we call it community immunization, is important, and you need 95% to guarantee that. So clearly there were several cases. So what happened? In fact, WHO quoted Italy as a negative example, comparing it to developing countries that were able to have a higher coverage, such as Rwanda and Tanzania, that had a higher coverage than our country. So what happened? There was compulsory vaccination. I'm sure there will be questions on this. I agree that I don't think they should be compulsory, but I think that we have to apply it now because of the difficulties that we mentioned. Well, in 4 months, on the 31st of December 2017, these same figures that were much lower improved in 4 months. Vaccination against diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, and polio increased by 1.3%, and the coverage for measles increased by 4.4% in just 4 months. What does this mean? It means that in this historical moment, compulsory vaccination is playing a positive role to convince people who are a bit undecided or fearful. Then there are many people who are against, and we know that that's 3 to 5% of the population, and maybe these people may not be convinced, but the waverers, the people who are not so sure, but given that it is compulsory in this day and age, they can improve the situation. This is the last slide, which shows the picture of the so-called vaccine calendar for life, which has been made available by the Ministry of Health, by the Pediatric Society, Hygiene Society, the Federation of Pediatricians, and the general practitioner. This calendar is a calendar which concerns all our lives, and you see that for children there are 15 vaccines, 10 which are compulsory with the 2017 law, and 7 that are advised in childhood, and also as boosters later. This is what I think I would like to say, and now let's move on to questions.
Seconda fase della conferenza, che poi è quello.
And now let us move on to the second part of the conference, which is the heart of the conference. That is to say, questions. Questions that we ask you to feel free to ask, so to speak. There are some rules. The questions have to be practical, without too many premises. You've got the form, and I'm summarizing them. They mustn't concern personal cases, and the people who ask questions have 1 minute. We will time them, and each time we will ask one or other of the speakers here to answer the question, and they will have 3 minutes maximum to answer. In the case, if it is necessary to have a second speaker, then we will have a shorter time for the second speaker. What can I add? Let's try and understand how many questions there are. How many questions? There are already quite a few.
Vorrei qualche informazione sul vaccino.
I would like to ask you some questions on what we call shingles, because I've always had very different opinions on it, because it's something that affects older people and can happen. Many friends of mine have already had it. I would like to know if this vaccination is good, whether I should do it or not. Well, Alberto Mantovani, also because of age and because of clarity, I must say that because of lack of time, I haven't yet done it, because I think that you must be very clear and very honest. I haven't done it only because I haven't had time to. There are, if I may add this, there are 3 vaccines that are advised of people of my age, so are above 60 and 65. Flu, pneumococcus, and zoster. The vaccine is effective. The relationship between side effects and vaccines is absolutely favorable, and the zoster causes suffering that I think that if you have friends of my age, you can bear witness of it. And it's one of the 3 vaccines for older people that is included in the calendar. You do it once for all, no boosters, unlike the pneumococcus. So is there a triple vaccine for people? No, there are 3 vaccinations. It's not one. Flu is seasonal. It's an immunological problem that we haven't solved. We haven't got one vaccine against flu. Pneumococcus, and great progress has been made also for developing countries, and I think it's good to have a memory. So 3 separate ones. I suggest you do it. I declared, as I've said, that I haven't had time, but I promise I'll do it. I'll do it before Christmas. Is there a best moment? No. Are there any comments and observations? You can... No?
Sì, buonasera. Allora, la mia domanda in parte si riflette su quella della signora
My question is very much like the previous ladies, and I would like to know if by vaccinating people against chicken pox, there is the possibility of developing herpes zoster. And the other question is if in the case of a pregnant woman, there are vaccines that are not advisable. Thank you.
Riguarda il
Gianni,
discorso della varicella,
as far as chickenpox is concerned, I'm talking about vaccines now, because we've well, 15 years ago we started, and for 15 years we monitored it to see the effectiveness of this vaccine and the possible side effects. So it's the greatest study for a vaccine in terms of the length, 15 years from 2002 till 2017. And there is no, and this helps me, your question allows me to say that you can't be sure that the people who have received the vaccine, and we're talking about children being vaccinated, we don't know whether these same people will have a zoster infection, because the zoster infection is linked to the so-called wild virus, so that is to say the one which we have as children, but then remains, in this case, a negative memory in the nervous system or in the myelin sheaths of the nerves, and later age, because of recontact with the virus, you have the so-called shingles, and in this case the vaccination is necessary, while the vaccination that you have as a child, which has a smaller amount of antigen for the time being, is probably able to prevent the zoster infection, but since it's 20, 30 years later, we haven't got certain data because we've only been studying it for 15 years. So I can't answer this scientifically. And the other one was the vaccines that you shouldn't take in pregnancy. Well, in pregnancy, not only there are no vaccines that we advise against, except with those with live attenuated viruses, such as the measles ones. But there are, in fact, some that are advised in pregnancy. For instance, the ones against whooping cough, which we suggest that mothers in the last trimester should take because the newborns have a 20% risk of dying of whooping cough if the newborn receives a contact with whooping cough, for which the child will be vaccinated in any case after the 3rd month. My question is vaccination against flu vaccine, the flu jab. When should one do it? Risks and side effects. And the question is, it's not it seems a personal case, it's not mine. There's a 90-year-old who has several problems, but not very severe ones, hypertension, a few cancers, and kidney failure. But the GP advises against the vaccination. She says that in the past she had an allergic reaction. I don't really believe this. So I would like to know what your opinion is on people who are very, very old. Who wishes to answer? I can start, and then maybe you can give the numbers. You can give. I always take a vaccinated. My daughter-in-law in the UK, my last grandchild, says my grandchild is called Leonardo. You can check it out, and he was vaccinated. I vaccinated my parents. My father's over 96, and I was also vaccinated my in-laws. So let's be clear about this. Our immune system ages, just like any other part of us. In fact, we think that parts of the immune system contribute to in aging. This is something that Italian researchers, in the sense that it's called inflammaging. If our immune system works well, that's fine. But if it's not working well, it contributes to the aging process. And an Italian colleague has discovered this. So we have problems when we age, or as we age. There are the idea of vaccinating if our immune system doesn't work so well, and the coverage that the vaccine, the flu jab gives is not as effective as we'd like it to be, or others are. But even this, because, for example, the strains were not guessed properly because the WHO has a sort of crystal ball. It's not quite that, but they project and decide which the strains have the largest possibility, though even the lowest coverage, there seem to be no counterindications. I don't know if you want to add anything. I would just like to add one point. I don't know which facts and figures I can give, but I would add this, that you were talking about the orchestration of the immune system and the different components of the immune system. Inflammaging is based mainly on macrophages. Vaccinations work on other components. So they strengthen part of the immune system, which counterbalance the degeneration which is associated with age. So vaccines, and the flu jab in particular, can contribute to a better health in the elderly person, where in any case you have degeneration of some of the components of the immune system. Good evening to you all. I would like to ask a question to Professor Mantovani, because I would like to refer to what you were saying of the fact that each individual is unique and histocompatibility. Medical research is aware of the genetic HLA genetic correlations for the development of autoimmune diseases. Considering that we know that this exists and can be triggered by infections that may be wild or even from vaccines, why not use for instance, an HLA test, which is possible to consider whether the person could develop autoimmune diseses? Could this be a screening? The answer is no. Why not? Because we are not able to foresee with a genetic approach the answer to a vaccine, nor are we able to foresee the onset of immune diseases. If I can say on autoimmune diseases. You are a woman, and they're a big problem because they're gender-based. Women, for instance, have more diseases than men. Some people tell me that 80% of the diseases in this world are born by women, but they are HLA genes that predispose, but there is no, and I repeat, no association between vaccinations and autoimmune diseases such as multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis and so on and so forth. This is the key point. We are not able to tell a person, don't take a vaccine because your HLA is wrong for it. We have a problem. I think a problem that we have to research this. And in our herd or group or community immunity, we have a number of people who do not react to the vaccine, and therefore they're not covered. And we have to say this very honestly. We don't understand why. And we don't know why that 90% that react, or say, to the measles vaccine will be 99, but that 1%, but the 1% is protected by the others. That's why herd or community immunity is very important, because it protects those who don't react to the vaccine. They're vaccinated, but they're not protected. We don't know why, because it's the wrong moment, because they've had an immune suppressive disease. We don't know, and they're topics of research.
O c'è una replica? No.
Buonasera. Allora, volevo parlare di vaccino influenzale.
I would like to talk about the flu jab. I saw that there are two types of vaccines, triple and quadruple. What's the difference? And before, how long is it before it's effective, and how long is it effective for?
Oggi diciamo che il vaccino più indicato.
Currently, let's say that the vaccines that is indicated for the more at-risk categories, that is to say, not those who have other diseases, but have a risk of, but let us say, children and elderly people, the vaccine, the quadruple vaccine, is more effective than the triple one, and we've had the opportunity to study this and experiment it in phase 2 and 3 of the initial ones, the preclinical ones, and it has a good coverage. Duration depends. It's tautological because it is a seasonal one and therefore has to be repeated every year, because the coverage does not exceed the year, because the structure of the vaccine has to change according to the season and to the type of flu that season bears. So it has to be repeated every year, but I would say the quadruple one. The campaign of the health system started 2 days ago, the 13th of November. Then there was another question. How many days after the vaccination are you immune? I would say, like all vaccines, about 2 weeks. 2 weeks to have the seroconversion that is able not to block the disease, but at least to attenuate it, but 2 weeks, I would say. And the effectiveness, once it peaks, is it constant in time? For the season in question, these vaccines remain, they're more effective, because in the past, to say it very clearly, I didn't say it at the beginning, but in the past, the effectiveness in children below 2 was absolutely not guaranteed for the flu vaccine. In fact, there was 20–30% of effectiveness. Now, with the quadruple one, we have 80%. Thank you. Excuse me if I reminded you of the question. Probably the virus changes then. Good evening. I suffer from diabetes. Diabetes 2, type 2. Many people suffer from it. I would like to know if, since I already take 3 drugs a day, one before lunch and the other one after, and the other one in the afternoon, 3 drugs a day, I would like to know whether this is compatible to also have the flu jab.
Quindi la risposta non riguarderà lei.
We cannot analyze single cases, so the answer will not concern you, but will be a more general answer, and we could reword the question as a patient or person with type 2 diabetes who already takes the 3 drugs, is it advisable that they should also take the flu jab or not? Or does that become a problem if you get vaccinated in that particular condition? Right. Diabetes is probably the biggest challenge that you have to overcome against the flu jab. Not so much diabetes type 2, which per se may have other types of complications, but diabetes type 1, the insulin-dependent or juvenile diabetes, but putting them all together, they require the fact that you should vaccinate, because there are no negative impacts or no negative effects in any of the cases, both with the diabetes type 1 and 2, but above all, it is a useless risk, especially since you have to take other drugs. Specifically because you have other drugs, so you don't want to have the risk that you have to take other drugs. I think that this is a strong message. As for the vaccinations in people with chronic diseases who sometimes are told not to take the flu jab and other diseases, unfortunately, we try to stimulate a general vaccination of all at-risk patients. And by at-risk patient, I mean patients with a chronic disease that requires, therefore, a protection against other diseases. Thank you.
Buonasera a tutti. Allora, avete parlato prima di immunodepressi.
Good evening to you all.
La mia domanda la faccio con questo.
You spoke about immune-depressed people, and my question is this example. I am immune-depressed, so in theory, I couldn't even be in a place like this. And so I would, should I feel, I don't understand, why would I feel more safer if people are vaccinated for 4 diseases when there are more than 100 diseases and I could get any of these? I think that anybody realizes, everybody will realize this anomaly, and so why should we use people like me who are immune-depressed when effectively there are lots and lots of disease? If I go to my GP and there are other people there who are sick and have the flu, and I could develop the disease. I would like an answer which corresponds to my question.
Dunque, noi facciamo il possibile per dare una risposta adeguata e ce la mettiamo tutta poi.
We do try to answer this question, then you will judge if it was adequate or not. I feel that well, first of all, we have to define what an immune-depressed person is. So I'm not going to debate your case, but when we talk about immune depression or immune suppression, we're talking about subjects. We have children, for example, who died at 18 months in the Monza hospital. 2 children died because they had acute lymphatic leukemia, 85% of probability of recovering, but they died of measles. I repeat it. Why? Because their immune system was undermined by the drugs, by the disease, the anti-cancer drugs that were used, the chemotherapy, and they cannot have a vaccine. The children with congenital immune suppression, the ones who used to live in a bubble, Gianni could talk about it more than me, or children who've been transplanted, who are treated with drugs, both children and adults, so I'm talking in general. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about in general about the impacts of immune suppression, people who are clinically immune suppressed. Now, we would like to have vaccines against everything. For example, we haven't a vaccine against malaria, for instance. We would like to have a vaccine against TB. We haven't got it. So inevitably, we offer the vaccines that can protect with the means that we have. For instance, I'll give you an example, a very practical example. You spoke about going to the GP surgery. We have an enormous problem of resistant germs. We have no vaccination against resistant germs. We hope that with scientific research, because Italy is also on the forefront of such research, we hope that we will have vaccines that will protect us also against resistant germs. Currently, we have a pneumococcal vaccine. And we go back to immune suppression, which is caused by flu. The viruses, for instance, and not only viruses, know our immune system better than Alberto Mantovani, and I see Guido Forni, who's a great immunologist and who's here. They know it better than us, and they are professional. Viruses are the real professionals. For instance, the vaccine against the pneumococcus protects against the pneumococcus that is association at some of the infections that we're talking about. Of course, we would like to have one against Trexiella, right? Unfortunately, we haven't got it. But we offer what scientific research has been able to generate, also thanks to the work done in Italy.
Posso fare un'aggiunta?
Sì, una replica.
Scusami, posso fare un'aggiunta?
No, certo.
Chiedo scusa.
Can I add something to that? Can I add something?
Sì, mi sembra un tema importante e rispetto
I think it's a very
perfettamente
important topic, and I fully understand your point of view. There is something which is important that is for the which we have in medicine as a whole, which is risk-benefits. So research has reached a certain point. Clearly, there are vaccines, but there are not vaccines for everything. We lack a lot of vaccines. It's reasonable that you should defend yourself with what we have and what medicine can offer, because in any case, it's better than not doing anything. So it is true that you can be exposed since you are immune suppressed, but to bacteria or viruses that have no vaccines, but you should defend yourself with existing vaccines, which is common sense, where the cost-benefit balance is in favor of benefits. And this is true for medical research, but with vaccines this is particularly true as compared to other treatments, because the cost-benefit balance is very much in favor of benefits. So this also answers that fact that there is they're not being used, the immune-suppressed people, because there's a benefit for them. Unfortunately, it's not a complete benefit because it's limited to those vaccines that are available, and there are not vaccines for all germs. It's a protection. I think that they too have an advantage, but unfortunately not for all germs, because is that right? Yes.
Buonasera.
Good evening.
Io volevo appunto continuare il discorso a proposito dei germi.
Talk about germs. The fact that there is a resistance against germs is due to the overuse of antibiotics. That is the fact that antibiotics were handed out without maybe bacteria, for instance. I would like to say, is this the same risk that we have with vaccines? So where vaccines will become useless to solve problems with germs? And then you spoke at the beginning on the fact that we are made of germs, but and then you said something which has nothing to do with vaccines. It's not that all these germs cause all the diseases together. So could you summarize this notion if I manage to express it? Well, one of the or other.
Sono stato citato per i germi.
Quoted for the germs. Just a premise, because there are some people who are queuing, so we have to be very brief, both the questions and the answers. Clearly, those germs, that 90%, 95% of germs that we are made of, do not all cause diseases, but many are. How do we know this? We learned this from clinical studies, because you and I are breathing spores of Aspergillus fumigatus, which is a fungus, but my and your system will manage without problems. In my hospital, in our hospital in Humanitas, Aspergillus in patients who received a transplant with a bone marrow transplant is a real problem. It's an enormous problem because the immune system doesn't control it anymore. So it is true that 95%, but a large number of the germs that we manage every day are a problem if the immune system doesn't work. We will have germs resistant to vaccines. Well, in a certain sense, the germs that create problems are the ones which we are not able to live with. There are people who have Klebsiella pneumonia resistant and do not develop the disease, but they transmit the disease. They're carriers. Will we have a population of germs resistant to vaccines? Well, the mechanism of action of vaccines is very different from drugs. There are not. We haven't had vaccine-resistant strains, for example, to polio. Polio just disappeared. Measles could disappear from the earth. That is to say, those 5,000 dead of measles, if we were able to cover and have a coverage which is good, say in developing countries, we would not have these deaths. So we have lots of problems in vaccines, but we haven't got the problem of resistance in the way in which it develops for antibiotics. Thank you. Was there a very brief thing? Paolo, I would like to say that what you're mentioning, that is to say antibiotic resistance is a tragic problem, is becoming dramatic in the world throughout, so much so that the head medical officer in the UK has listed as the first and second health problem which the UK has been developing and will develop because there will be antibiotic-resistant bacteria which might affect people who have, for example, small surgery. The origin of this problem, there is certainly an overuse of antibiotics, partly also the administration of antibiotics, in particular in the US, to calves. but to say that resistance to antibiotics is a part of the prevention of infectious diseases, but vaccines play a key players. I forgot one thing on the relationship between vaccines and resistance, that the opposite is true. That is to say, the introduction of vaccine against the pneumococcus, which we should be very proud of as Italians. I'm not going to say why, but in African countries shows that the introduction of since you use fewer antibiotics because it is related to or causes a decline in the use of antibiotics. Where there are vaccines and we use them, there are fewer cases of resistance that develop.
È stata pubblicata la relazione finale della Commissione parlamentare.
In February 2018, the final report of the parliamentary committee that investigated the damages and deaths correlated to the soldiers who were exposed to chemical substances, uranium, and vaccinations, which is what I'm interested in. They said that on healthy and adult men, they should not, to avoid this correlation, they should not be administered more than 5 vaccines, that it is necessary to carry out pre-vaccine tests, and these tests have to be given with a single dose. I was really surprised since the decree had been just introduced, why on very small children you have 10 vaccines, and I would like to understand what studies that people referred to, and to what way do they interface with the results of this MP committee that used expert doctors. Gianni Bona can answer the second part.
Non entro nel merito della Commissione. Ecco, do una risposta alla seconda parte della domanda.
I'm not going to say anything about the parliamentary committee. I will answer the second part of the question. Just to say that, as I mentioned several times in answering, we have had for years a center that experimented, that is to say, studied the effect of vaccinations with new vaccines, given that it is one of the many centers in Italy and in the world, because the studies as far as new vaccines are concerned have thousands and thousands of patients who've been studied, not just because they've received the vaccine, but because for years there's a follow-up, as I said, for chicken pox, but also with controls from an immunological point of view and from any consequence of vaccinations, and especially with relation to the fact that several vaccines are given together. It's one of the most important humanitarian discovery, because 4 injections, I only have one granddaughter, but when she received a vaccine against pneumococcus and the 6th vaccine, and when she received them together, but not in the same syringe, so 3 different injections, she had a certain difficulty in accepting them. But let us not forget that with 3 injections, she covered 9 diseases. So the essential approach is that more vaccinations together, as Professor Mantovani said, does not cause an overload on the immune system. I would separate what the committee said and the impact of vaccinations, which may be added to other problems that these people had. Let us not talk about uranium now, but as far as the population of children, that is to say, from the 61st day of life, they can be vaccinated. During the first phase, we have the 6th vaccine, the 6th disease vaccine, and then we have another 3, the triple one, 9 different substances, and they do not give, and the studies are on hundreds of thousands of vaccinated people who have, that is to say, these studies are published on JAMA, Lancet, and on the New England Journal of Medicine. That is to say, but they're not some studies, there are many. These are tens of studies that were published following the evaluation of the impact of these vaccinations administered either separately or together. Can I ask a question? Have you got a bibliography? Yes. We can maybe give it, I can't give it to you, but yes, we can give her. If you look on the Academy's website, we give all the bibliography on scientific journals. I stress on the fact on scientific journals where you, when you make a mistake, if you make a mistake, you have to withdraw it or be withdrawn. So that's science. But if you go on the website of our Academy, you will find the Academy of Science, you'll find it. If you do a single vaccination, you are not doing the good of the children, because 95% of the cases, maybe if you should listen to this, 95% of the causes of damages to vaccinations are not to autoimmune diseases or to fake ones. They are due to the mistake of the inoculation. So the fewer useless injections we give, let's give multiple vaccinations with one injection. And this is the result of international studies.
Vorrei fare alcune osservazioni in merito a quanto si è detto sui vaccini.
I'd like to make a few comments on what was said about vaccines. First of all, I never heard you mention the effects of the excipients or the inactive ingredients which have a negative effect. But it's not only that, but the problem that they can activate autoimmune pathologies. I'm not saying this, but it is research, immune research of the past 30 years that is ignored, and you're unjustified in doing this. There are tens and tens of thousands of articles that refer to the genetic predisposition of the vaccines acting as a trigger. I don't why you ignore this information that should be essential to understand chronic disease, which is the suffering of humanity, and official medicine is disregarding it. To give you an example, I think that we've understood the sense of your question. Just to give time to those after you, an insulin-dependent diabetes may be also triggered by an antirotavirus vaccine on the genetic predisposition, and it is not compulsory to have the rotavirus vaccine, but when I do it, because it triggers, triggered, these are documents that are on PubMed.
Per quanto riguarda, posso rispondere sul discorso rotavirus, poi mi lascio.
Can I answer? As far as the rotavirus is concerned, on the rotavirus, this might concern, please excuse me because there is an inaccuracy. There are very few papers, two, on the association between rotavirus and celiac disease, but as was said very clearly, it's a predisposition. You spoke about DR3 and DOC2. These are two haplotypes that express a risk of disease. It's an autoimmune disease. We've all said this. It's a gendered disease where there's a wonderful ratio between men and women. So it is a risk of falling sick in a disease that might develop, might be diagnosed, maybe late, but that in any case has never been seen in millions of doses of the antirotavirus vaccine. We'd had an experiment 30 years ago on this. The risk that the antirotavirus is that of causing an intestinal invagination in subjects at the 6 months. But this is no longer true with the new vaccine. There are 20 million doses that are administered every year, because the US have a strongly recommended, this is listed amongst the strongly recommended vaccinations. So would you like to add anything? No, you said everything. The risk that existed was that of, and I'm quoting it, but rotavirus causes many deaths, especially in developing countries. I would like the rotavirus vaccine arrived until the last village of the poorest countries of the world to save some hundreds of thousands of people. I can't remember exactly the figures, but that's it. You say that we're all predisposed, but could it be triggered by the vaccine? These are immune mechanisms. Yes, because there are some people who say that there are thousands of studies published on PubMed. If they're figures, they're figures. Maybe Paolo Vineis can say something. These studies are apparently 3. We have to understand what it means and how it is produced and how it's assessed, because if you don't understand this, you have no dialogue. That is to say, there's a lot of scientific literature. There's an official one, and there's another one which is not official, as you were saying. There's a scientific method, which is a very rigorous one, which is based on the ability to replicate results. There are many labs in the world that carry out research, that can carry out molecular research, can be in large populations. As I mentioned, more than 1 million children have been studied on autism. They have been carrying out research on mercury that was present many years ago, was present in US vaccines, and results show that there is no cause-effect relationship. And these are on millions of people. Then there is a literature which is a submerged literature. There are studies that are very difficult to evaluate. Now there is the journals that publish anything if you pay them, and which is spreading. And then, as we know, there's internet, fake news, or trolls, and so on. That is to say, there's a great pollution of information, and you have to be able to interpret it. There is a sort of higher tier in science, which is the evaluation or the assessment of evidence. Scientists produce the evidence, genetic expert, epidemiologists, and then there are, for instance, the Centers for Disease Control in the US that assess the evidence and reaches a certain conclusion, a conclusion which can be very clear. For instance, vaccines do not cause autism. If you say so, probably they fall into that gray area or dark area, which is made up of trolls and fake news. I'm saying this and not in an argumentative way. I think we all have to learn how to know or understand how scientific evidence is produced, and I think maybe we can reach an understanding. Good evening. First of all, I wanted to ask Dr. Mantovani that last year there were 6 deaths due to. Yes, you said, probably you meant measles, but you heard smallpox. No, yes, sorry. Please, I will And it's an errata corrige, a mistake. I was referring, please forgive me, since that you two admitted that you don't know why in some people, in fact, there is no coverage. At this point, I was wondering, well, the herd is a hypothesis or is a peer-reviewed concept? Well, I mean, I will then give the floor to the expert, which has been reviewed. Seen again, there are different tiers. PubMed doesn't mean anything. It was used before. Why? Because in PubMed, there are still the fakes. One was mentioned, but also journals which are very mediocre. And it's just the classification of everything that is written. So there are very good poems like the Divine Comedy, and if I were to write a poem, it would be terrible. So unquestionably, the notion of PubMed is the result of all the immunology studies and of epidemiology. If it's something that we're sure of, is that there is herd immunity. Please correct me. Not only, but there are analyses to be even more certain. There are algorithms that were developed, that is to say, calculations to see what level of coverage is necessary according to the possibility of transmitting this. Measles is very infective. Correct me, Gianni, if I make a mistake. If you're infected, if 1 to 20. Ebola that frightened us, in fact, they have a very different, it's 1 of 4. So you calculate on the basis of the results, we say the coverage that we need to ensure the immunity of the community to protect the weakers is whatever it is. But if there's something that we're sure of, is that. Next question. Good evening. At the beginning, you spoke of effectiveness and the safety in time, and then you mentioned chicken pox. So it's 15 years, and we don't know what will happen later. So my question is, since we're starting to vaccinate children at 3 months, when the child reaches a teenage, is there no risk of the threshold? I'm talking about my son. If I vaccinate him now, in 10 years, might he still get mumps, to say, which would be a problem for a teenager? Maybe because I wasn't very clear. Since we have been using this vaccine for 16 years. We have data only on that. But because the good thing about vaccinations is that they're flexible. Because if we were to see that there are some cases, but this hasn't happened for measles or for the others, because all those who fell ill between 15 and 39 had not received 2 or even 1 dose of vaccination. So we can say this very simply, and in this case we have no doubts. If there were some spread, even limited, of vaccinated cases after a given period of time, correctly vaccinated with 2 doses, then the government, WHO or whoever, will decide or can decide to have a booster to strengthen this ability of defense, which may be declined in time. I can say something today that all vaccination, for example, hepatitis B vaccine, was not necessary to have further boosters after the 3 or 4, the vaccinations that you have, and no one has had hepatitis B being vaccinated. This is 30 years old now, and in this case, too, we've seen that many years later there were no risks of developing diseases following the vaccination. So for the time being, we can say that. Good evening. A very quick question. I'm not a doctor. And I didn't understand the first answer that you gave on the herpes virus. I didn't understand if you had chicken pox as a disease, not as a vaccine. Is it easier or harder for them to develop herpes at a later age? Herpes zoster, shingles, is a disease that you have once you've had chickenpox as a child. So, if you didn't have developed chickenpox as a child, you can't have herpes zoster. And we're talking about as a disease. Yes. Once you've had herpes zoster, once are you vaccinated? Yes. Yes, you can only have it once.
Mi viene in mente la Mongolia, che ha una copertura.
I'm thinking of Mongolia that has a coverage of vaccination of 97% of measles, which has had a lot of epidemics of measles since 2015. Why? And then why is there no longer the possibility of vaccinating, say, the anti-tetanus and the German measles too separately? We have to have it. I have, say, if a youngster has had mumps and German measles, must still take a vaccination, or if you have to have a booster of the tetanus, you have to have all the other vaccinations. Thanks. It's you again. As far as I don't know, but I'll give you my email so you can send me the date of this great epidemics in Mongolia where all are vaccinated. I didn't know anything about it. Did you know anything? No, never heard of it. I don't know, but it doesn't mean, honestly, I feel it's rather strange because, frankly, all the things that we've seen in the countries where vaccinations are introduced. We can't answer. We'll try and find the cases. 50,000 cases. The email address is not info@centroscienza, but GiovedìScienza @centroscienza.it. Right. I'm sorry. We can't hear it. The answers, we can only give the answers of what we know.
La notizia sulla Mongolia è indicata da una quantità.
The news on Mongolia is listed by many, and I would like to, in talking about scientific work and their validity, I would like to know what you think on the Cochrane-Godze case, that is to say, a scientist who was very good at analyzing scientific work, and that because he eliminated some papers on vaccines against papillomavirus, was sacked from the Cochrane that should be above and outside all the pharmaceutical companies meddling. I would also like to understand why you say that children can receive a large number of vaccines because they have vaccines, well, they're all the natural barriers like skin, and when in nature there are no cases of parenteral introduction of 6 antigens, as happens with the multiple vaccination. I say that the first cases, it's bad for science, and The Cochrane was split on this, while then I will give you the second half, the others will answer. Yes. The case of Goetze is a very special case. First of all, I would like to say that it is normal that there is a difference of opinion in the scientific community. It's always happened, and it's very healthy. Secondly, I would like to offer polarizations. Unfortunately, polarization is very common in our day and age. I don't think Goetze is the best case. He's already in the past was opposed to breast scans. The issue was resolved in the sense that the overwhelming majority of the people who assessed the scientific papers on breast screening reached a different conclusion. This Danish researcher was selecting the articles, so the consequences that he drew on breast screening derived from the method he was using, and in the end the scientific community disagreed. This can also be true for HPV. There are certainly possible objections, for instance, the fact that the vaccine was introduced in 2007. There isn't a long enough period of observation to see that there's an effect to prevention of cancer, but everything is suggesting that it might. The scientific community is dynamic and dialectic, so it is normal that you should have this dynamic. Goetze is a person who is on the edges, but he should be respected, but you mustn't take this difference of opinion within a scientific opinion to polarize opinions and to then take extreme positions simply because one scientist said one thing while the overwhelming majority had different opinion, and not because they were paid by multinationals, frankly. Yes, it was also a problem of communication. The 4 members of the Cochrane resigned. Did you want to say something? Can I answer? The natural barrier, skin, unquestionably, our skin, our intestine, our gut, our bronchus is covered by a physical barrier. This physical barrier is not enough. And so much so that our immune system, this is a discovery if I repeat it, but it's an Italian discovery. Our immune system has specialized cells that put like a periscope to perceive what there is outside the barrier, because this is a very permeable barrier. This is a barrier where we discover that there are bacteria that pass through it. It's a barrier that if and when we have a difficulty, becomes extremely permeable. And these again are studies. So it's not a barrier which is it's not like a waterproof plastic cellophane layer. If the immune system doesn't work, that barrier is useless. Our immune system is basically very important because it monitors what is happening on the other side, selects the good and bad, because science is also full of uncertainty. We still haven't understood it's true, of questions. And one of the things that we understand and that we don't understand is how our immune system decides what is good, the germs that are good and the germs that are useful from the others. But it does that every day. And every day it has to deal with problems that are more important than the 5 vaccines that my 8 grandchildren received. Thank you very much. Thank you.